The following Monday afternoon, Jem and I climbed the steep front steps to Mrs. DuBose's house and padded down the open hallway. Jem, armed with Ivanhoe and full of superior knowledge, knocked at the second door on the left. "Mrs. DuBose," he called. Jessie opened the wood door and unlatched the screen door. "Is that you, Jem Finch? She said you got your sister with you." "I don't know. Let 'em both in, Jessie," said Mrs. DuBose. Jessie admitted us and went off into the kitchen. An oppressive odor met us when we crossed the threshold, an odor I had met many times in rain-rotted grey houses where there are coal oil lamps, water dippers, and unbleached domestic sheets. It always made me afraid, expectant, and watchful. In the corner of the room was a brass bed, and in the bed was Mrs. DuBose. I wondered if Jem's activities had put her there, and for a moment I felt sorry for her. She was lying under a pile of quilts and looked almost friendly. There was a marble-top washstand by her bed, and on it was a glass with a teaspoon in it, a red-ear syringe, a box of absorbent cotton, and a steel alarm clock standing on 3 tiny legs. "So you brought that dirty little sister of yours, did you?" was her greeting. Jem said quietly, "My sister ain't dirty, and I ain't scared of you," although I noticed his knees shaking. I was expecting a tirade, but all she said was, "You may commence reading, Jeremy." Jem sat down in a cane-bottomed chair and opened Ivanhoe. I pulled up another one and sat beside him. "Come closer," said Mrs. DuBose. "Come to the side of the bed." We moved our chairs forward. This was the nearest I had ever been to her, and the thing I wanted to do most was move my chair back again. She was horrible. Her face was the color of a dirty pillowcase, and the corners of her mouth glistened with wet, which inched like a glacier down the deep grooves enclosing her chin. Old-age liver spots dotted her cheeks, and her pale eyes had black pinpoint pupils. Her hands were knobby, and the cuticles were grown up over her fingernails. Her bottom plate was not in, and her upper lip protruded. From time to time, she would draw her nether lip up to her upper plate and carry her chin with it. This made the wet move faster. I didn't look any more than I had to. Jem reopened Ivanhoe and began reading. I tried to keep up with him, but he read too fast. When Jem came to a word he didn't know, he skipped it, but Mrs. DuBose would catch him and make him spell it out. Jem read for perhaps 20 minutes, during which time I looked at the soot-stained mantelpiece, out the window, anywhere to keep from looking at her. As he read along, I noticed that Mrs. DuBose's corrections grew fewer and farther between, that Jem had even left one sentence dangling in midair. She was not listening. I looked toward the bed. Something had happened to her. She lay on her back with the quilts up to her chin. Only her head and shoulders were visible. Her head moved slowly from side to side. From time to time she would open her mouth wide, and I could see her tongue undulate faintly. Cords of saliva would collect on her lips. She would draw them in, and then her mouth would open again. Her mouth seemed to have a private existence of its own. It worked separate and apart from the rest of her, out and in like a clam hole at low tide. Occasionally it would say put, like some vicious substance coming to a boil. I pulled at Jem's sleeve. He looked at me, then at the bed. Her head made its regular sweep toward us, and Jem said, "Mrs. DuBose, are you all right?" She did not hear him. The alarm clock went off and scared us stiff. A minute later, nerves still tingling, Jem and I were on the sidewalk headed for home. We did not run away. Jessie sent us. Before the clock wound down, she was in the room, pushing Jem and me out of it. "Shoo," she said. "You all go home." Jem hesitated at the door. "It's time for her medicine," Jessie said. As the door swung shut behind us, I saw Jessie walking quickly toward Mrs. DuBose's bed. It was only about 3:45 when we got home, so Jem and I drop-kicked in the backyard until it was time to meet Atticus. Atticus had 2 yellow pencils for me and a football magazine for Jem, which I suppose was a silent reward for our first day's session with Mrs. DuBose. Jem had told him what had happened. "Did she frighten you?" said Atticus. "No, sir," said Jem, "but she's nasty. She has fits or something. She spits a lot." "She can't help that. When people are sick, they don't look nice sometimes." "She scared me," I said. Atticus looked at me over his glasses. "You don't have to go with Jem, you know." The next afternoon at Mrs. DuBose's was the same as the first, and so was the next, until gradually a pattern emerged. Everything would begin normally, that is, Mrs. DuBose would hound Jem for a while on her favorite subjects, her camellias or our father's nigger-loving propensities. She would grow increasingly silent, then go away from us. The alarm clock would ring, Jessie would shoo us out, and the rest of the day was ours. "Atticus," I said one evening, "what exactly is a nigger lover?" Atticus's face was grave. "Has somebody been calling you that?" "No, sir. Mrs. DuBose calls you that. She warms up every afternoon calling you that. Francis called me that last Christmas. That's where I first heard it." "Is that the reason you jumped on him?" said Atticus. "Yes, sir." "Then why are you asking me what it means?" I tried to explain to Atticus that it wasn't so much that what Francis had said that had infuriated me as the way he said it. It was like he was saying snot-nose or something. "Scout," said Atticus. Nigger lover is just one of those terms that don't mean anything, like snot nose. It's hard to explain. Ignorant, trashy people use it when they think somebody's favoring Negroes over and above themselves. It slipped into usage with some people like ourselves when they want a common, ugly term to label somebody. You aren't really a nigger lover then, are you? I certainly am. I do my best to love everybody. I'm hard put. But sometimes, baby, it's never an insult to be called what somebody thinks is a bad name. It just shows you how poor that person is. It doesn't hurt you. So don't let Mrs. DeBose get you down. She has enough troubles of her own. One afternoon a month later, Jem was plowing his way through Sir Walter Scott as Jem called him, and Mrs. DeBose was correcting him at every turn. When there was a knock on the door, "Come in," she screamed. Atticus came in. He went to the bed and took Mrs. DeBose's hand. "I was coming from the office and didn't see the children," he said. "I thought they might still be here." Mrs. DeBose smiled at him. For the life of me, I could not figure out how he could bring herself to speak to him when she seemed to hate him so. "Do you know what time it is, Atticus?" she said. "Exactly 14 minutes past 5. The alarm clock set for 5:30. I want you to know that." It suddenly came to me that each day we had been staying a little longer at Mrs. DeBose's, that the alarm clock went off a few minutes later every day, and that she was well into one of her fits by the time it sounded. Today she had antagonized Jem for nearly 2 hours, with no intention of having a fit, and I felt hopelessly trapped. The alarm clock was a signal for our release. If one day it didn't ring, what would we do? "I have a feeling that Jem's reading days are numbered," said Atticus. "Only a week longer, I think," she said, "just to make sure." Jem rose. "But," Atticus put out his hand and Jem was silent. "On the way home, Jem said he had to do it just for a month and that the month was up and it wasn't fair." "Just one more week, son," said Atticus. "No," said Jem. "Yes," said Atticus. The following week found us back at Mrs. DeBose's. The alarm clock had ceased sounding, but Mrs. DeBose would release us with a "that'll do," so late into the afternoon, Atticus would be home reading the paper when we returned. Although her fits had passed off, she was in every way her old self. When Sir Walter Scott became involved in lengthy descriptions of moats and castles, Mrs. DeBose would become bored and pick on us. "Jeremy Finch, I told you you'd live to regret tearing up my camellias. You regret it now, don't ya?" Jem said he certainly did. "Thought you could kill my snow on the mountain, did you? Well, Jessie says the top's growing back out. Next time you'll know how to do it right, won't you? You'll pull it up by the roots, won't you?" Jem said he certainly would. "Don't you mutter at me, boy. You hold your head up and say yes, ma'am. Don't guess you feel like holding it up, though, with your father, what he is." Jem's chin would come up and he would gaze at Mrs. DeBose with a face devoid of resentment. Through the weeks he had cultivated an expression of polite and detached interest, which he would present to her in answer to her most blood-curdling inventions. At last the day came, when Mrs. DeBose said, "That'll do," one afternoon, and she added, "And that's all. Good day to you." It was over. We bounded down the sidewalk on a spree of sheer relief, leaping and howling. That day, spring was a good one. The days grew longer and gave us more playing time. Jem's mind was occupied mostly with the vital statistics of every college football player in the nation. Every night, Atticus would read us the sports pages of the newspaper. Alabama might go to the Rose Bowl again this year, judging from its prospects, not one of whose names we could pronounce. Atticus was in the middle of Windy Seaton's column one evening when the telephone rang. He answered it, then went to the hat rack in the hall. "I'm going down to Mrs. DeBose's for a while," he said. "I won't be long." But Atticus stayed away until long past my bedtime. When he returned, he was carrying a candy box. Atticus sat down in the living room and put the box on the floor beside his chair. "What you want?" asked Jem. We had not seen Mrs. DeBose for over a month. She was never on the porch any more when we passed. "She's dead, son," said Atticus. "She died a few minutes ago." "Oh," said Jem. Well is right," said Atticus. "She's not suffering any more. She was sick for a long time." "Son, didn't you know what her fits were?" Jem shook his head. "Mrs. DeBose was a morphine addict," said Atticus. "She took it as a painkiller for years. The doctors put her on it. She'd spent the rest of her life on it and died without so much agony, but she was too contrary." "Sir?" asked Jem. Atticus said, "Just before your escapade, she called me to make a will for her. Dr. Reynolds told her she had only a few months left. Her business affairs were in perfect order, but she said, there's still one thing out of order." "What was that?" Jem was perplexed. "She said she was going to leave this world beholden to nothing and nobody. Jem, when you're sick as she was, it's all right to take anything to make it easier. But it wasn't all right for her. She said she meant to break herself of it before she died, and that's what she did." Jem said, "You mean that's what her fits were?" "Yes, that's what they were. Most of the time you were reading to her, I doubt if she heard a word you said. Her whole mind and body were concentrated on that alarm clock. If you hadn't fallen into her hands, I'd have made you go read to her anyway. It might have been some sort of distraction. There was another reason." "Did she die free?" asked Jem. "As the mountain air," said Atticus. "She was conscious to the last, almost conscious," he smiled, "and cantankerous. She still disapproved heartily of my doings and said I'd probably spend the rest of my life bailing you out of jail. She had Jessie fix you this box." Atticus reached down and picked up the candy box. He handed it to Jem. Jem opened the box, and inside, surrounded by wads of damp cotton, was a white, waxy, perfect camellia. It was the snow on the mountain. Jem's eyes nearly popped out of his head. "Old hell devil! Old hell devil!" he screamed, flinging it down. "Why can't she leave me alone?" In a flash, Atticus was up and standing over him. Jem buried his face in Atticus's shirt front. "Shh," he said. "I think that was her way of telling you everything's all right now. Jem, everything's all right. You know, she was a great lady." "A lady?" Jem raised his head. His face was scarlet. "After all those things she said about you, a lady?" "She was. She had her own views about things a lot different from mine, maybe. Son, I told you that if you hadn't lost your head, I'd have made you go read to her. I wanted you to see something about her. I wanted you to see what real courage is. Instead of getting the idea that courage is a man with a gun in his hand. It's when you know you're licked before you begin, but you begin anyway and you see it through no matter what. You rarely win, but sometimes you do. Mrs. DuBose won, all 98 pounds of her. According to her views, she died beholden to nothing and nobody. She was the bravest person I ever knew." Jem picked up the candy box and threw it in the fire. He picked up the camellia, and then when I went off to bed, I saw him fingering the wide petals. Atticus was reading the paper.